Welcome to Unforeseen Fates, where every story prepare you for the unknown.
Case 1. Gloria Williams, The Apartment of Shadows, Houston, 2020. It was October 24th, 2021, when a trembling 15-year-old boy in Houston finally picked up the phone and whispered to a 911 dispatcher, "My brother's been dead for a year and his body is in the room next to mine." Deputies from the Harris County Sheriff's Office rushed to the City Park 2 apartments on Greencrest Drive, unsure of what they were about to find. When they arrived, the smell hit them first, thick, sour, and unmistakable. Inside the small, dim apartment, the sight that awaited them would haunt even the most seasoned investigators. 3 children, ages 7, 10, and 15, were inside, living completely alone. They were malnourished, dirty, and terrified. The apartment was infested with cockroaches, littered with trash, and without electricity or food. In the bedroom next door, beneath a thin blue blanket, lay the skeletal remains of 8-year-old Kendrick Lee, the youngest of the 4 siblings. He had been dead for nearly a year. Before tragedy consumed that apartment, Kendrick was described as a bright, cheerful little boy who loved cartoons and drawing. He lived with his mother, Gloria Williams, and her boyfriend, Brian Coulter. The family had been on the radar of Child Protective Services for years. Reports of neglect, beatings, and unsanitary conditions had surfaced multiple times, but each case was eventually closed. The system failed to intervene, and the children slipped back into danger. 2 of Kendrick's brothers were autistic, making them especially vulnerable and dependent on their mother for protection. In November 2020, everything changed. According to witness statements, Coulter lost his temper during dinner and began attacking Kendrick, kicking and punching him repeatedly until the small boy went limp. His younger siblings watched helplessly. When Kendrick stopped blinking and breathing, Coulter stopped hitting. Gloria Williams did not call 911. She and Coulter wrapped Kendrick's body in a blanket, placed him in the bedroom, and carried on with life as if nothing had happened. A few months later, the pair moved out of the apartment entirely, leaving the 3 surviving children behind with their brother's body still there. Gloria occasionally dropped off food, juice boxes, chips, and noodles, but she never stayed. The children survived in silence, terrified to leave, and lived alongside Kendrick's remains for almost 11 months. When the oldest brother finally made that desperate 911 call, it broke open one of the most disturbing child neglect cases in Texas history. Deputies found the children skeletal and traumatized. One investigator said it was like stepping into a nightmare frozen in time. Both Gloria Williams and Brian Coulter were arrested. Coulter confessed to the killing, but denied intending to murder the child. In April of 2024, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Later that year, in October, Gloria Williams pleaded guilty to 2 counts of injury to a child by omission and to tampering with evidence for concealing the corpse. In November 2024, she was sentenced to 50 years in prison. The case shocked not only Houston, but the nation, raising painful questions about how no one, not neighbors, not authorities, had intervened. The surviving brothers were placed in state custody, finally safe after nearly a year of unimaginable horror. Judge Linda Garcia, who presided over the sentencing, called it one of the darkest examples of abandonment this court has ever seen. The apartment, now empty, became known locally as the Apartment of Shadows. Kendrick Lee's story remains a haunting reminder of the deep failures of both motherhood and the system meant to protect children. For nearly a year, 3 young boys lived beside death itself, and somehow they survived long enough to tell the world what had happened behind that closed door. Case 2. Amanda Hawkins, the party mother from hell, Kerrville, 2017. June 7, 2017, Kerrville, Texas. The night was humid, thick with cigarette smoke and laughter. In a small shed behind a friend's house, a group of young adults partied through the night. They drank, smoked marijuana, and blasted music. Among them was a 19-year-old mother named Amanda Hawkins, young, carefree, and desperate to fit in. Parked just outside the shed sat her car. Inside, strapped into their car seats, were her two daughters, 2-year-old Addison Overguard Eddy and 1-year-old Bryn Hawkins. They had been left there for hours. At some point during the night, another partygoer heard crying and asked Amanda to bring her girls inside. Her response was chilling. "No," she said, "they'll cry themselves to sleep." By sunrise, the air outside was already stifling. By noon, the temperature inside that car had turned deadly. The girls, still strapped in, were baking in the heat, their small hands reaching for a door that wouldn't open. When Amanda finally went to check on them the next day, and their bodies were limp and drenched in sweat, Bryn and Addison were dying, victims not of an accident, but of their mother's indifference. Instead of calling 911, Amanda panicked. She brought them inside and placed them in a bathtub, running cold water over their burning skin, searching the internet for how to cool down heat stroke. For nearly 2 hours, she tried to revive them on her own, not out of love, but out of fear of what would happen if anyone found out. When she finally brought them to Peterson Regional Medical Center, she lied. She told doctors the girls had passed out after smelling flowers by a lake. But the medical staff immediately knew the truth. Both toddlers were severely overheated, their core body temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Despite desperate attempts to save them, they died on June 8, 2017. Dr. John Gebhardt, who led the emergency team that day, later testified that Amanda was giggling and texting as doctors tried to resuscitate her daughters. "There was no emotion," he said, "just excuses." Witnesses came forward from the party, telling investigators that Amanda had knowingly left the girls in the car for more than 15 hours while she drank and smoked. The truth was undeniable. Amanda Hawkins was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including 2 counts of injury to a child and 2 counts of abandoning or endangering a child. During her sentencing in December 2018, Judge Keith Williams looked her in the eye and delivered words that echoed far beyond the courtroom. "People in our community treat their pets better than you treated your kids." Amanda Hawkins pleaded guilty and received 40 years in prison, 20 years for each count, served concurrently. Her daughters, Addison and Bryn, were buried side by side, their graves marked with pink flowers and teddy bears, left by strangers who could not comprehend the cruelty of their deaths. The case shocked Texas, not only because of its horror, but because it wasn't a mistake. Amanda hadn't forgotten her children. She had heard them crying. She had chosen to ignore them. To this day, their story remains one of the most haunting examples of parental neglect in Texas history, a reminder that evil isn't always loud or violent. Sometimes it's the quiet choice to do nothing while innocence dies behind a locked car door. Case 3, Cynthia Marie Randolph, teaching a lesson. Gone to Hell, Parker County, 2017. It was May 26, 2017, a suffocating afternoon in rural Parker County, Texas. The sun hung heavy in the sky, the air shimmering at 96 degrees. On a dusty patch of land near Lake Weatherford stood a modest home where 25-year-old Cynthia Marie Randolph lived with her 2 toddlers, 2-year-old Juliet Ramirez and 16-month-old Kavanaugh Ramirez. That afternoon, the children wandered outside to play. Juliet, independent and spirited, refused to come inside when her mother called. For most parents, that would have meant a warning or a timeout. But for Cynthia, something dark took over. A burst of anger that would end in tragedy. In what she later described as a lesson, she shut the car door, locking both children inside. She believed Juliet would eventually learn how to unlock the door herself. Then, as the minutes passed, Cynthia turned and walked back into her house. Instead of checking on them, she smoked marijuana, watched television, and then fell asleep. Outside, The temperature inside that sealed car climbed rapidly, reaching well above 130 degrees. Juliet and Kavanaugh's cries grew weaker as the heat swallowed the air around them. By the time Cynthia woke up, hours had passed. The car was silent. She stepped outside and froze. Both children were motionless, slumped against their car seats, their small faces red and swollen from the heat. But even then, Cynthia's first thought wasn't to call for help. It was to cover her tracks. She broke one of the car's windows and rehearsed her lie. They must have locked themselves inside while I was sleeping. I tried to save them. When she finally called for help, it was too late. Paramedics arrived to find both toddlers long dead. As investigators began piecing the story together, they noticed cracks in her account. The details changed every time she spoke. In one version, she had been doing chores. In another, she claimed she had only left them for a few minutes, but detectives saw through it all. After 13 hours of interrogation, her composure shattered. She finally confessed she had locked her children in the car on purpose. She wanted Juliet to learn her lesson. When the Texas Rangers pressed her on why she didn't open the door sooner, she said simply, "I thought they'd be fine." The autopsy reports told a different story, one of unbearable suffering. Both Juliet and Kavanaugh died of exogenous hyperthermia or heat stroke. Their core temperatures were measured at over 120 degrees. Their skin bore the marks of prolonged exposure to extreme heat, and their final moments would have been filled with confusion and pain. Neighbors wept openly as news spread. One recalled seeing Cynthia outside her home the next day, calm and composed, watering plants as if nothing had happened. In June 2017, Randolph was arrested and charged with 2 counts of injury to a child causing serious bodily injury, a first-degree felony. Her trial began in 2018 in Parker County, where jurors were shown the hours of video footage from her interrogation, her shifting stories, her sighs, her emotionless confessions. When the guilty verdict was read, the courtroom fell silent. The jury sentenced her to 2 concurrent 20-year prison terms, the maximum penalty allowed under her charges. As she was led away, prosecutors reminded the court of what had driven their determination. This wasn't an accident. This was punishment. This was cruelty. Cynthia Randolph is serving her sentence today in a Texas state prison. She will not be eligible for parole until her mid-40s. Her 2 children, Juliet and Kavanaugh, rest together in Weatherford, surrounded by flowers and toys left by strangers who never knew them, but who couldn't forget their story once they heard it. Their case became one of the most disturbing examples of parental rage in Texas history, a moment where discipline turned into death, where a mother's twisted attempt to teach a lesson ended 2 innocent lives before they ever had a chance to begin. As Parker County Assistant District Attorney Abby Plack said after the sentencing, their lives were taken before they ever had the chance to start. This sentence ensures she'll never take another. Case 4, Sheborah Latrice Thomas, the Calm Killer, Houston, 2016. It was August 12th, 2016 in Southeast Houston, an ordinary Friday that would end with one of the most haunting crimes in Texas history. Behind the walls of a small, weathered home on Tierwester Street, 30-year-old Sheborah Latrice Thomas carried out a plan that seemed more methodical than emotional, more deliberate than desperate. Inside that house lived 3 children, 12-year-old Dee, 7-year-old Araylon Ray Thomas, and 5-year-old Kayana Thomas. Only one would survive. That morning, neighbors later said the home was quiet, eerily so. One by one, Sheborah brought her youngest children into the bathroom. First Kayana, then Ray. She filled the tub with water, lifted them in, and held them under until they stopped fighting. There were no screams from the house, no signs of struggle. When it was over, she drained the tub, wrapped their small bodies in sheets, folded their clothes neatly, and set them aside. She then cleaned the bathroom, dressed herself, and went about her day. The next morning, she even went to work as if nothing had happened. For nearly 2 days, no one knew. After the killings, Sheborah tried to dispose of the evidence. She placed the bodies in a garbage bin behind her home and began digging a hole in the backyard. The soil was too hard, the hole too shallow. When she couldn't dig deep enough, she pushed the children's bodies beneath a neighbor's house through a crawl space and covered the entrance with debris. To the outside world, she was calm, detached, unbothered. Then on Sunday, August 14th, she confided in a friend, a man who sometimes helped her with small repairs. She said in a voice so steady it unnerved him, "I killed them. I had to leave town." At first, he thought it was a joke, but as her words sank in, he realized the horror she was describing was real. He immediately called the Houston Police Department. When officers arrived, Sheborah calmly told them where to find the bodies. They found the 2 children exactly where she said they'd be, under the neighbor's house, wrapped in sheets. Inside her home, her oldest son, 12-year-old D, was safe and unharmed. He hadn't been home during the murders. Detectives described Sheborah's demeanor as almost chilling in its flatness. No tears, no regret, no visible emotion. One investigator said, "She talked about drowning her kids the same way someone would talk about running errands." Sheborah Thomas was arrested and charged with 2 counts of capital murder. At her first court appearance, she stood silently beside her attorney, offering no apology. Years passed as her case was delayed by psychiatric evaluations and legal reviews. Finally, in March 2023, nearly 7 years after the crime, she accepted a plea deal, avoiding the death penalty. Harris County District Attorney Kim Ogg announced the plea, saying, "This mother knew what she was doing. She knew it was wrong. We vowed to seek justice for these 2 children." Sheborah pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. She will be in her 70s before she is even eligible for release. The plea spared her surviving son and family from enduring a full capital murder trial. But for the investigators who worked the case, the memory never faded. They described it as one of the most disturbing crimes they'd ever seen, not because of rage or chaos, but because of how calm it was. Psychologists later studied her case as a chilling example of maternal detachment, a state where emotion is replaced by calculation, where killing isn't done in anger, but in eerie silence. The home on Tierwester Street was eventually demolished, but for the people who remember, that address is etched in memory. 5-year-old Kayana and 7-year-old Ray never had a chance to grow up, laugh again, or dream about their futures. Their names may not make headlines anymore, but their story remains one of the most haunting reminders that sometimes evil doesn't scream. Sometimes it whispers and smiles while it destroys everything it was meant to love. Case 5, Taylor Rene Parker, The Womb Raider, Bowie County, 2020. October 9th, 2020, New Boston, Texas. Inside her quiet home, 21-year-old Reagan Simmons Hancock was glowing with anticipation. 8 months pregnant, she had spent the last few days arranging tiny clothes, washing baby blankets, and counting down to the moment she'd finally held her daughter, Braxlyn Sage, in her arms. But that morning, a nightmare began, one so brutal, so inhuman, that it left even seasoned investigators shaken. When police arrived at Reagan's home, they found a scene straight out of a horror film. Reagan had been stabbed more than 100 times. Her skull had been crushed from repeated blows with a hammer, and her body, her womb, had been cut open. Her unborn daughter was gone. The woman responsible for this atrocity wasn't a stranger. She was someone Reagan knew and trusted, 27-year-old Taylor Rene Parker. Parker had spent nearly a year weaving an elaborate lie. She pretended to be pregnant to keep her boyfriend from leaving her, fabricating ultrasound photos, faking doctor's appointments, and even throwing a gender reveal party. Her obsession with maintaining that fantasy consumed her. As her supposed due date approached, the walls of her deceit began closing in. So, in a decision that defied all comprehension, she decided to make her lie real. She would take a baby, no matter the cost. A few hours after the murder, Parker was pulled over for speeding about 40 miles away. In her lap, she cradled a newborn baby, barely clinging to life. She told the state trooper she had just given birth on the side of the road. But when she arrived at the hospital, doctors immediately knew something was wrong. The baby showed signs of traumatic delivery, but Parker's body didn't. There were no physical signs of childbirth at all. As investigators retraced her steps, the horrifying truth came into focus. Parker had spent weeks watching online videos about childbirth, C-sections, and infant care. She had prepared for this, not as a mother, but as a murderer. When police searched Reagan's home, the scene told them everything. The struggle, the terror, the unimaginable pain. Reagan had fought for her life and for her baby until the very end. During Parker's 2022 trial in Bowie County, the courtroom was gripped by emotion. Prosecutors laid out every calculated detail, from the deception to the planning to the killing. But it was the voice of Reagan's mother that silenced the room. Through tears, she said, "My baby was alive, still fighting for her babies when you tore her open and ripped her baby from her stomach." Her words hung in the air. A mother mourning not one, but two lives stolen in the most violent way imaginable. Taylor Rene Parker was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death in November 2022. She now sits on death row at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, awaiting the state's ultimate punishment. The media would later label her the Womb Raider of New Boston, a name that barely captures the cruelty of what she did. But to Reagan's family, that title means nothing. No headline or sentence could ever undo the horror of that day or fill the silence left behind. This was not a crime of impulse. It was premeditated, methodical, and born from a web of lies so deep that it ended in blood. The story of Reagan Simmons Hancock and baby Braxlyn Sage remains one of the most chilling reminders of what happens when obsession turns to madness and when a lie becomes lethal. Case 6, Sarah Nicole Henderson. Mom, Don't? Henderson County, 2017. It was the dead of night on November 2nd, 2017, in the small community of Mabank, Texas. The Henderson home on Philpott Road sat still and quiet under the glow of a single porch light. Inside, everyone was asleep. A father, his two daughters, and the woman who would soon become the center of one of Texas's most heartbreaking crimes. At around midnight, the silence shattered. 2 gunshots rang out. Inside the bedroom, 31-year-old Sarah Nicole Henderson stood over her sleeping daughters, Kyla, age 7, and Kaylee, just 5 years old. In her hand was a .380 caliber pistol. She raised it and fired once into each of their small, innocent faces as they slept. Then she turned the gun toward her husband, Jacob Henderson, and pulled the trigger. Click! A misfire, a single metallic sound that became the difference between life and death. That click saved his life. In the days leading up to the murders, Sarah had been unraveling. Jacob later told investigators that she had grown paranoid, sleepless, and terrified, whispering that people were out to get them. Deputies and paramedics had been called to the home earlier that same night after Jacob reported that Sarah was acting erratically. When they arrived, Sarah appeared calm and convincing. She told them everything was fine. They left. But something inside her was spiraling. Later that night, she told Jacob she believed the girls were in danger, that the only way to keep them safe was to send them to heaven. When the gun misfired, Jacob woke up. He saw Sarah standing there, gun in hand, smoke in the air, and his daughters motionless in their beds. In blind panic, he wrestled the weapon from her grip and held her down while dialing 911. The recording of that call is one of the most chilling in Texas history. His voice trembles as he tells the operator, "She shot them. She shot both of my girls." When officers arrived, they found Sarah sitting on the porch, calm and expressionless. The children were dead. Jacob was covered in blood, his cries echoing through the night. When an officer asked Sarah why she had done it, her answer was soft but deliberate. "I wanted them in heaven." Detectives later said she showed almost no emotion during the entire interrogation. No tears, no regret, just exhaustion and detachment. Sarah Nicole Henderson was charged with 2 counts of capital murder. The prosecution initially sought the death penalty, but her defense entered a plea of insanity, arguing that Sarah was suffering from a severe mental break. 2 court-appointed psychiatrists examined her and came to the same conclusion. She was mentally ill, but she had known what she was doing was wrong. She understood that killing her daughters was against the law, and that made her legally competent to stand trial. Facing overwhelming evidence, her confession, the 911 call, and the forensic proof, Sarah's attorneys negotiated a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. In July 2019, Sarah Nicole Henderson pleaded guilty to both counts of capital murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will die behind bars. In court, Jacob Henderson gave a statement that broke everyone's hearts. He said quietly, "I forgive her, but I will never understand." The murders of Kyla and Kaylee Henderson shook the small community to its core. Friends and neighbors who knew the girls described them as bright, loving, and inseparable. They loved drawing, playing with their dog, and helping their dad in the yard. Their laughter once filled that little house on Philpott Road, laughter that was silenced forever that night. Experts later described the case as one of the most devastating examples of filicide, born of delusion, when mental illness warps love into destruction. The home still stands today, quiet and unremarkable, but those who pass by say the place feels heavy, as if the echoes of that night never left. And for the father who survived, the silence inside those walls is its own kind of life sentence. I wanted them in heaven. Case 7, Jessica Briones, The Broken Facade, San Antonio, 2022. It was an ordinary afternoon on September 5th, 2017, at a Northwest Side police substation in San Antonio. Officers were going about their day when the front doors suddenly swung open and a woman stepped inside carrying something that froze the entire room. 39-year-old Jessica Briones stood in the doorway holding the limp body of her 4-year-old daughter, Olivia. She didn't call 911. She didn't scream. She simply walked in, her child's lifeless form cradled in her arms, and said she needed help. Officers rushed forward, but it was already too late. Olivia was unresponsive, her tiny frame cold and still. As paramedics laid her down, the truth began to unfold across her fragile body, a story written in bruises. There was a large, swollen lump on the back of her head, arms bent at unnatural angles and dark bruises of varying ages covering her from neck to ankle. Jessica's frantic pleas for help rang hollow because Olivia's body told the real story, one of pain, violence, and years of hidden suffering. To the outside world, Jessica Briones appeared to be an exhausted single mother doing her best. Friends and neighbors saw her smile for photos, posting online snapshots of herself and her daughter, the perfect image of a loving mom. But behind those filters and smiles was a home filled with fear. Little Olivia had no one but her mother, and she trusted her completely. Each time a new bruise appeared, Jessica had an explanation. She's clumsy, she'd say. She falls a lot. But those lies masked something far darker. When paramedics rushed Olivia to the hospital, doctors immediately knew this wasn't an accident. A CT scan revealed a massive subdural hematoma, bleeding on the brain caused by a violent impact. The damage was catastrophic and the pressure on her brain was irreversible. Doctors and nurses who treated her later testified that Olivia's injuries couldn't have come from a fall or a single blow. They were the result of repeated forceful trauma. The medical examiner found older, healed fractures. Both arms had once been broken. There were fractured vertebrae in her spine and signs of a deflated lung. On September 6, 2017, Olivia was pronounced dead after being removed from life support. When detectives confronted Jessica, she clung to her story, claiming Olivia had fallen. But the evidence didn't lie. In a 5-hour interrogation, a San Antonio police sergeant sat across from her and quietly said, "These injuries aren't from a fall, Jessica. They're from someone doing this to her." The case moved slowly through the courts, delayed by years of backlogs and appeals. Finally, in October 2022, Jessica Briones stood trial in the 187th District Court of Bexar County. For 3 weeks, jurors listened to the haunting details of Olivia's final hours and the years of abuse that led up to them. Prosecutors argued that Jessica used household objects as weapons: a wall, a metal bracket, a door frame, turning her home into a place of torture. Witnesses described Jessica as manipulative, maintaining her calm facade even as images of Olivia's injuries were shown in court. Several jurors were seen in tears as the medical examiner described how long Olivia's brain had been swelling before she died. The judge, Stephanie R. Boyd, called the evidence devastating and unforgettable. On October 31, 2022, the jury found Jessica Briones guilty of murder and injury to a child. The next day, she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole only after serving 30 years. Her conviction was upheld on appeal in 2024. After the verdict, District Attorney Joe Gonzalez addressed the media, saying, "This little girl suffered unspeakable cruelty at the hands of her own mother. We can only hope this sentence brings justice, if not peace, to her memory." Olivia's case became a symbol of hidden abuse, of how evil can live quietly behind a smiling face. It also reignited conversations in Texas about the warning signs of domestic child violence and the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong. To this day, Jessica Briones maintains her innocence, but the bruises, the fractures, and the fear Olivia lived through remain as silent witnesses, undeniable proof of what really happened. And for the officers who were there that afternoon, the image of a mother walking into a police station holding her dead child will never fade. Because sometimes monsters don't break down doors or come in the night. Sometimes they walk in calmly pretending to ask for help after it's far too late. Case 8, Meagan Work, the Selfie Mom, Austin, 2014. July 7th, 2014, Southeast Austin, Texas. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon when Meagan Work and her boyfriend, Michael Turner, pulled their car off the road and onto a lonely dirt path along Felter Lane. The headlights cut through the still air, slicing across tall weeds that swayed in the summer heat. In the back of their vehicle lay the body of a 2-year-old boy, Colton Turner, wrapped in a purple blanket, silent, gone. Michael borrowed a shovel from a friend. Under the cover of darkness, he dug a shallow grave, barely 2 feet deep in a patch of dry soil near the tree line. Then together, they buried him, covering the grave with scraps of wood and sheetrock. While Michael dug, Meagan sat inside the car, scrolling on her phone, detached and distant. It was the final act in a long chain of cruelty. The cold disposal of a child she had already destroyed through months of neglect and abuse. Colton Turner was small for his age, with a shy, uncertain smile that barely reached his eyes. Behind that sweetness was a life defined by instability and pain. His mother, Meagan, was 20, a drifter, a chronic liar, and a master of appearances. On social media, she was carefree, taking mirror selfies, flashing peace signs, pretending everything was normal. But behind those smiles, Colton was living a nightmare. Child Protective Services had received 4 separate reports of suspected abuse and neglect. Each one ended the same way. Meagan and Michael would disappear before investigators could find them. They lived in motels, on the road, constantly running. CPS would close the file, unable to locate them. Behind those closed motel doors, Colton was starving, bruised, and terrified. In the days before his death, witnesses saw Meagan slamming his small head against a truck door, a loud thud that made one friend turn away in disbelief. Colton later began seizing, but instead of taking him to a hospital, Meagan and Michael decided to nurse him back to health. They feared what CPS might discover. By the morning of July 7th, 2014, Colton Turner was dead. For 2 months, the truth stayed buried, literally. Then, in September 2014, a friend who had seen pictures of Colton covered in bruises finally went to the police. She told them she couldn't stay silent anymore. Detectives found Meagan and began asking questions. Her answers were lies, one after another. First, she said Colton was with family in East Texas. Then she claimed he had been kidnapped. Finally, she told them she had given him away to a couple outside a fast food restaurant. Investigators pressed harder. They found Michael Turner in jail on a probation violation, and when they questioned him, the truth spilled out. He confessed that Colton was dead and that he and Meagan had buried him on Felter Lane. When police uncovered the shallow grave, they found Colton's tiny body wrapped in the same purple blanket. The cause of death could not be determined due to decomposition, but the evidence of abuse was overwhelming. For years, Meagan Work maintained that she hadn't killed her son, that she was only guilty of failing to get help. But the state saw through her attempts to minimize what she had done. In August 2018, she finally pleaded guilty to injury to a child by omission and tampering with evidence. The sentencing hearing stretched over 4 emotional days. Colton's grandmother, Kim Vidor, took the stand and delivered a statement that left the courtroom in tears. "Your decision, Meagan, to take the life of a tiny, innocent, sweet, beautiful little boy with no regard for his life is the definition of pure evil." Judge P. David Wahlberg presided over the case. He acknowledged Meagan's own traumatic childhood, her history of sexual abuse and neglect, but made it clear that her suffering did not excuse what she had done. He called Colton's death a tragedy that could have been prevented at every turn. Meagan Work was sentenced to 30 years in prison for injury to a child and 20 years for tampering, served concurrently. She will be eligible for parole around 2033. The outrage that followed Colton's death reverberated far beyond Austin. Lawmakers, activists, and citizens demanded answers. How could 4 separate CPS reports fail to protect a child in such obvious danger? In the wake of the case, Texas passed Colton's Law, requiring CPS to immediately notify the Department of Public Safety, DPS, when a child under investigation cannot be located. The law allows officers to issue alerts and detain a parent or guardian until the child's safety is confirmed, a direct safeguard meant to prevent another case like Colton's. Today, at the site where Colton was buried, there's a small memorial, a white cross surrounded by toys, flowers, and photos, left by strangers who never knew him but could not forget him. The story of Meagan Work, the so-called Selfie mom, remains one of Texas's most haunting reminders of how deception and neglect can destroy what is most pure. Because behind every smiling photo, every filtered lie, there was a little boy, unseen, unheard, and forgotten until it was far too late. Case 9, Christy Sheats, Family Meeting Massacre, Katy, 2016. June 24th, 2016, Katy, Texas. The afternoon sun was fading over the quiet suburban streets of Remsen Hollow Lane when one of the most shocking domestic murders in Texas history began to unfold. On the 9/11 recording later released by police, a man's voice can be heard, trembling, pleading, desperate. Please don't point the gun at us. I beg you, I promise you, whatever you want. It was Jason Sheats begging his wife, Christy, to stop. In the background, their daughters, Taylor, 22, and Madison, 17, could be heard crying, their voices breaking through the chaos. Then came the gunshots. Moments later, the violence spilled into the street. Neighbors called in, horrified as they watched from behind their blinds. One woman's voice cracked over the phone. "She's coming back again. Oh God, she shot her again," and the one lying on the ground. What had started as a family meeting in a living room had turned into a public execution on a quiet suburban street. To outsiders, the Sheats family looked like the picture of happiness. Christy, 42, was active on social media, posting photos of her family, smiling dinners, birthday parties, vacation snapshots. She seemed like the proud mother of two beautiful daughters and a loving wife to a quiet, devoted husband. But the image was a lie. Police records revealed that between 2012 and 2016, officers had been called to the Sheats home 14 times for domestic disturbances. Christy had long battled severe depression and suicidal behavior. She had been hospitalized multiple times for mental health crises and was on a complex regimen of medications that she often refused to take. Friends later said that Christy's emotional instability had deepened in the months leading up to the murders. Her marriage was crumbling, her mental health was deteriorating, and she was furious that her eldest daughter, Taylor, was planning to get married. On the morning of June 24th, Jason's birthday, Christy and Jason had discussed divorce. That conversation, it seemed, was the final spark. That evening, Christy called her husband and daughters into the living room, saying she wanted to have a family meeting. Believing she wanted to talk through their problems, Jason agreed. As they sat down, Christy reached between the couch cushions and pulled out a 5-shot .38 caliber revolver, a gun she had inherited from her grandfather. Without a word, she raised it and fired. Panic erupted. Jason and the girls bolted toward the front door. Madison was hit first, collapsing in the entryway. Taylor made it out of the house, screaming for help. Christy followed her into the street and shot her again as neighbors watched in horror. Then, in an act that showed chilling premeditation, Christy walked back inside, calmly reloaded her revolver, and returned to the street. She stood over Taylor, who was lying wounded on the pavement, and fired the final fatal shot into her daughter's chest. When Fort Bend County deputies and a Fulshear police officer arrived on the scene, they saw Christy standing in the street, revolver in hand, the bodies of her daughters nearby. Officers shouted at her to drop the gun. She refused. A single round was fired by a Fulshear officer, killing her instantly. The tragedy was over, but the horror would linger forever. Taylor and Madison were dead. Jason Sheats, the only survivor, stood surrounded by the bodies of the family he had just lost. The investigation revealed a disturbing truth. Christy had deliberately spared Jason's life. Sheriff Troy Niels later stated that Jason told him Christy had looked him in the eye during the shooting and said she wanted him to suffer, that killing their daughters was her way of punishing him. It was revenge masked as maternal love, the ultimate act of control from a woman whose life was unraveling. In the weeks that followed, the family meeting massacre made national headlines and reignited debates about gun access, domestic violence, and mental health intervention. Many questioned how a woman with a documented history of suicidal behavior and psychiatric hospitalizations still had access to a firearm. Jason Sheats later moved away from Texas, unable to bear the memories that lingered in every corner of that home. He described his wife as a woman who loved her daughters but hated losing control, a mother whose final act destroyed everything she once claimed to cherish. Today, the Sheats home has long since changed owners. To strangers, it's just another suburban house on a quiet cul-de-sac. But to those who remember June 24th, 2016, it's a place forever haunted, not by ghosts, but by the echo of a father's screams, two daughters' cries, and the sound of a gunshot that ended a family forever. Because that night, in what was supposed to be a conversation about family, a mother decided that if she couldn't have them, no one would. Case 10. Sandra Melgar, the anniversary killer, Houston, 2012. December 23rd, 2012, Houston, Texas. The Melgars had just celebrated what should have been a milestone, 32 years of marriage. But by the following morning, that image of love and faith would shatter forever. When family members arrived for a holiday party, they found the home in chaos. In the master bedroom closet lay 52-year-old Jaime Melgar, dead, stabbed 31 times with a kitchen knife. Blood covered the floor, walls, and bed linens. In a small separate bathroom closet nearby, they found Sandra Melgar, tied at the wrists and ankles, sitting on the floor, disoriented. She told police she'd had a seizure and remembered nothing. She claimed the last thing she recalled was relaxing in the hot tub with her husband after dinner. To detectives, it looked like a botched home invasion, but to trained investigators, something felt off. Too clean, too controlled, too staged. Sandra and Jaime were high school sweethearts, faithful Jehovah's Witnesses, and seemingly devoted. Jaime worked hard and cared for Sandra through various medical challenges, but prosecutors would later argue that Sandra felt trapped, dissatisfied, yet strictly bound by her faith's moral code that forbade divorce. Prosecutors posited that to Sandra, murder was the only acceptable escape, a way to end her marriage without being shunned. From the start, police were uneasy with Sandra's story. There were glaring contradictions. No forced entry, not a single window or lock was damaged. Untouched valuables, cash, electronics, and jewelry were in plain sight, untouched. Jaime's death. His body showed clear defensive wounds, and the medical examiner concluded he was already dead or dying when his ankles were tied. Sandra's condition. She had no defensive injuries, and the knots around her wrists were suspiciously loose. The weapon. The murder weapon, a knife, was found submerged in the jacuzzi tub, along with one of Sandra's blouses, suggesting a frantic attempt to wash away evidence. A faint chemical burn on Sandra's hand hinted at a cleaning solution. To police, this was the moment the staging broke down. The murder case was deeply polarizing. The prosecution argued that Sandra was a calculated killer who had committed the crime, then faked her own abduction and seizure to craft an alibi. The defense claimed police had tunnel vision, pointing to unidentified DNA found at the scene, and portraying Sandra as a loyal wife and victim. Her daughter, Liz, never wavered, maintaining her mother's innocence throughout the proceedings. Verdict and sentence. After a 3-week trial, the jury found Sandra Melgar guilty of murder in August 2017. She was formally sentenced in 2018 to 27 years in prison. Today, Sandra Melgar remains in prison, still claiming innocence. The Innocence Project of Texas continues to investigate her case, arguing that the original investigation was flawed and biased. The anniversary killer remains one of Texas's most haunting domestic mysteries, a story of faith, deception, and the chilling realization that a lifetime of devotion can be extinguished by a single, calculated act of rage and desperation. From 2012 to 2025, Texas has seen far more than 10 lives lost, children, families, and entire generations torn apart by the very people meant to protect them. These weren't strangers, they were mothers, and the pain they left behind still echoes across time. But this is only part one. There are more stories, darker, deeper, and even harder to forget, still waiting to be told. Before we move on, share your thoughts below. Which story broke your heart the most? Which victim do you refuse to let be forgotten? Every comment, every voice keeps their memory alive. And if you're ready to go even further to see part 2, roll out immediately, type "ready for part 2" in the comments. If you haven't already, please like this video, share it, and subscribe to Unforeseen Fates, not just for the stories, but for the people behind them. Because together we don't just watch, we remember, we speak, and we make sure their names will never fade away.